Hello everyone, it's Chris Schmidt from Rocket Lasso. We've got so much to cover here in R23, I am not going to do a lengthy introduction here. If you're watching this when the video is new, be sure to check the description below because there's a link to a live stream I'm going to be doing on Wednesday with Rick Barrett from Maxon, where we're going to talk about a whole bunch of the R23 features. But for now, let me give you an overview of everything that is new. The first thing to mention is that if you had the perpetual license and you did not have access to S22 and its features, now that you have R23, you will have all of those features as well as the R23 features. Speaking of which, let's begin stepping through the new features in no particular order. The first new feature we're going to be going over is the Remesh Generator. Now, what do I have right here? I've got a car from the content browser and I want to create a low poly proxy of it so I could run soft bodies and smash the car. You can't do that on this big complicated model, but we could make a lower poly version of it if we wanted to. So in this case, I would do something like creating a volume mesher, a volume builder, and here's actually the first new feature we can see. If I were to drag the sedan, you'll see the first new feature, and that is we get these wonderful highlights of exactly where we're going to be placing the object. A small thing, but a big quality of life improvement. Dropping this into the volume builder, into the volume mesher, you can see we're getting a much lower polygon version of this overall object. But if we wanted more detail, we could start cranking up the voxel size, by which I mean we shrink it and we get more geometry. We can make it smaller and smaller and smaller, getting more and more detail. But if we were to try and run soft bodies on this, it's going to run crazy slow. It wouldn't be any good. We would not like the result. However, now we have the Remesh Generator. This is based off the instant meshes algorithm, so it's really nice having this directly inside of Cinema, especially something that is parametric. So dropping the volume mesher inside of the remesher, we can see instantly when I select it, that's going to go from that kind of weird polygon flow. Right here, it's kind of these voxel-based ones, and when we turn on the remesh, we can see that they're flowing along the surface a lot nicer. Now, there's one main setting that we're worried about here, and that is the mesh density. Currently, it's trying to match the poly count that it was fed. However, now we can drop this down to, let's say, 50% and give it a moment, and it is now generating half the number of polygons. Drop this down to something like 10%. You can see that there's very few polygons relative to what we were feeding in. When it comes to soft bodies, it would not like this. It would really like this. And we could keep dropping this further and further, and I continue to be impressed, even down at, let's say, 2%. This is very much the shape of the car, and soft bodies would work really, really quickly on this. There's a bunch of different settings here. We're not going to go into all of them. You will see it's generating triangles here, and there's no way around that. There is a checkbox to say only quadrangles. However, if we turn that on, all it's doing is subdividing by one. If you feed triangles into like a subdivision surface, it turns them into squares. It turns them into four-sided polygons. So in this case, we could do that. However, it's just making more geometry, and in this case, wouldn't really be improving anything. Just because I think it's so useful as a new tool, let's do another very practical example of how to use the remesh. Now, if you remember, the very first tutorial ever from Rocket Lasso was one with Aaron Covret. We went and made an object based off of photogrammetry. Specifically, I took a whole bunch of photos with my iPhone and then brought them into Mesh Room from alicevision.org. And this was the end result that piece of software was able to bring in. It's wonderful. It looks great. However, if I hit NB, you're going to see the amount of polygons that were generated is absolutely insane. So we can't deal with that. We want to keep this object, and we want to even keep these materials. So let's talk about that process as fast as we can. Now, in this case, how about making a copy and paste of that original object? We don't need any of these materials for the new one we're working from. And hitting NB, we can see the poly count. The very first thing I would like to do is make this a little more reasonable by creating a remesh, dropping the mesh density down to 10%, and then dropping the model in. Now, considering how many polygons there are, we're just throwing this in raw and not being generous to the remesh at all. We're going to see it doesn't take that long to recalculate. Now it's complete. If we zoom up, we can see that we've got, let's hide the original. You can see that this has remeshed, and we are now at 1/10 the number of polygons we had. There's still a lot. There's a ton of detail. But the reason I like doing this is I don't know exactly where I want to land, and I don't want to recalculate the entire time. So now, how about baking this remesh down? That gives us this as an end result. Still way more detail than I need. So now creating another remesh, I can drop this mesh inside and make way quicker changes to it overall. So in this case, dropping it down to, let's say, 10%. This is 10% of 10%. So this is 1% of the original polygons, and you can still see how many there are. How about dropping this down to, I don't know, 1%? So we're now at 0.1% of the polygons that we used to have, and that's actually pretty reasonable. I like the way that looks overall. So if we want to keep that, we could bake this down again. However, we'll spend just a second and talk about the flow splines. I don't have these intuitively figured out yet. However, let's go ahead and turn on some splines I already pre-drew, and you can see, let's hide that for a moment. You can see that I've got a couple circle splines around the stump and then some straight lines along the flat area. So now that I've drawn those splines, I should be able to jump into the remesh and drag those in. In fact, I'll hit lock, grab all those splines, drag them in, and then unlock it. And let's see what the resulting mesh is from that. Now you can see, actually, that's really good. You can see how these are all flowing along that line. Instead of them being kind of at the 45-degree angle, they're now attempting to be straight lines along the Z-axis as I drew the splines. So this is looking really nice. I'm going to keep it at this 1% of 10% and make it editable. And that's essentially wrapping up the remesh part of this. However, if you're interested, skipping ahead, I have now transferred the material from the high poly object to the low poly object. And you'll see if we go to object mode that this looks amazing. We've got so few polygons and it looks almost identical in quality to the one that has, what is it, 100,000 times as many polygons. So with that in mind, you can go check out the full tutorial if you want to see how to do it. The short version is applying a fully reflective material and then using the UV unwrapping to make a nice map and then transferring it with a bake material tag. And that just becomes the wonderful final material. And let's just take a look at those poly counts again. Here is what we're actually seeing right now, hiding that one. We can bring back the original, and Cinema's going to choke on that for a little bit because there's so many polygons. So you can clearly see the advantages of using the new Remesh Deformer. Next up, the new UV features in R23. I've got a female model that I made a while ago here, never quite finished it. Here I have separated them into 3 objects so we could always put them in connect and re-weld them. And in this case, they're separated out so we can actually see some of the new features. Going to polygon mode, you can see that I've got the entire body, I've got the hands separated and the head. I also took the liberty of cutting out the seams already. So if I double click on the selection tag, you can see that I have selected some edges, some edge loops where I want the seams to be. I always think of this like you're making like a teddy bear or something. This is what the fabric pattern would look like. Where would the seams be? So you could lay the fabric flat on the table. And the more even you can get them, the better. And along the hands, the fingers are separated out and it travels along the side. And on the head, you can see that there's one big seam traveling along the top of the head and the back, and then a little bit underneath the chin. Typically, you want those in places you're not going to see very much because, of course, that's where the seams show up. So let's change our layout to the Cinema 4D UV Edit layout. The first thing you'll see here is this lovely grid on top of our UV editor. I want to see some of our UVs, so let's begin with the body, double clicking on the edge selection to make sure I've got that. This is so simple to do now. I can just click on the set UV from projection. It's going to take a frontal projection, and then I can click UV unwrap, and based on the edge cuts I had done, it's now separated out all of the different pieces. Firstly, let's say we want to align these different pieces better, so let's grab the torso right here. Selecting some of the polygons, I can hit UW, selecting the entire island, and I could hit R for rotate and start spinning this kind of any axis. If I hold down Shift, you see it's going to be snapping on units of 5. They've now, in a more handy way, moved the quantizing settings right here. So this is how it moves, rotates, and scales when you hold down Shift. So in this case, I want to rotate exactly 90 degrees, so I could type in 90. And now as I spin this, if I go far enough, boom, it will pop to 90 degrees. Next up, we've got a new tool, and that is if I select edge mode and I select some edges that I think are kind of perfectly vertical. They're very up and down. So right there, that's pretty up and down. And let's say I want to align these legs. I'm going to grab the edge right above the kneecap, and over here, the edge right above the kneecap. And now I can click the Align UV Islands button, and all of these will line up straight up and down based on that single edge that we had selected. Sticking with moving this stuff around, if I were to grab this island here, E for move, scoot it a little bit. Let's zoom up onto one of the corners and go to point mode because there is now improved snapping settings. In R22, this did not work at all. If I were to select any one of my edges and go to move it, yes, it will move. But now we can turn on the snapping settings. So hitting P for the snapping menu, I can turn on snapping, and I can say that I want to snap to a vertex. I can snap to an edge. I'll turn those two on, and now you can see I can move this around, and it'll snap right to a point, and it can also snap to an edge as well. That is a wonderful little addition for us being able to get very clean, fine-grained control of this. In addition, we could be snapping to the new grid. So turning on grid and work plane, I should be able to click on one of these points again and snap straight onto that grid. You can change the grid settings by going to mode and finding UV settings. And under here, there is our filter. Yeah, under filter, then here's our grid. We can set the subdivisions however we like for separating this all out. And if we zoom in, you're going to get the subgrid. If we zoom in and zoom in, you'll keep getting subdivisions of 10 by 10 by 10, which is pretty neat. And lastly, for snapping, we can actually do a pixel snap. In order to see this, we need to have applied some sort of material that we could paint on, which I already set up. So I can click on that material there. And if I were inclined, I could go and do a little paint scribble here. And now that I've done that, go back to P for snap, and I can say I want not the work plane and now the pixel snap. So selecting a single point from somewhere, let's say that one, I can now very carefully zoom way up, hit E, and now you'll see that I'm actually snapping on a per pixel basis. You can see I'm snapping right to the corner of each pixel, so you can get incredibly precise with all of that. Let's undo that paint because we don't need to see it. Back to the body, back to the UVs. Zoom out, and let's check out the next little section of features. Going to polygon mode, I could zoom up on this section of the leg. Actually, I don't want to see this pink, so I'm going to change this back to an empty canvas, and then we'll re-navigate over here. All right. Now what I'd like to do is make a selection of quads, four-sided polygons that are all nice, even neighbors of other four-sided polygons. Now that I've done that in polygon mode, I can click on the UV rectangularize button, and instantly they will turn into a nice, even, perfect rectangle. Clicking on the cogwheel, you can see there's a couple different settings, including my new favorite named parameter, which is equidistant distribution. Great name. Turning that off, well, let's make another selection. Let's grab these down here. And now if I click it, then you'll see that we'll get a nice rectangle, but it's just maintaining their spacing a little bit more. Instead of them being evenly spaced, you can see that they were separated out, so it maintains that separation. Clicking on the cogwheel again, turn on equidistant, and reapply. Now you see they become very square. Now, if I were to hit UW and select the entire section, if I click rectangularize, it's actually going to give us a warning because we got some funky polygons right in here. This knee does not allow for the layout. So this is really for some very even polygon layouts. If I want to keep straightening this out even more, I could do a selection right there, UW, rectangularize. Actually, let's do that without the equidistant. That will even that out. Let's make another loop right along this edge. Grow, 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 UY being the shortcut. Let's even that out as well. And now that these are evened out pretty well, we could probably select all of these and say equidistant again, and now those will even out quite a bit. We can do the same thing down here. Keep in mind, this only works with a single patch. I couldn't select this and do both at the same time, only one of them. So let's even those out. And then we have another tool. If we go to edge mode, I can do some loops, UL, and do a loop right there and click UV straighten, and it will straighten that line out. Clicking the cogwheel, we have a couple settings, including keep length and equidistant distribution. I'm gonna say, don't worry about that. And now we just get a nice straight line there, a nice straight line right there, and one right there. We can actually select as many of these as we want. And then if I click it, then those will all straighten out and get very even overall. So these two tools, UV straighten and UV rectangularize, are a really great way of making these things lay out a little bit more mechanically. Having said that, we can go back to polygon mode, and something I like doing is if we were to lay that entire thing out, I could grab this knee section right there, grow my selection, and then under relax UV, make sure that I have pin border points turned on. And I can say, hey, this knee isn't very evenly spaced out, so let's click apply on the smoothing, and it's going to smooth that out and make it a little bit more even of a transition around there. If you want to get weird, you could select, let's select UW, select this entire island. I could click apply here, and because we're pinning the border points, it will actually try and stretch these to the way that they look individually, try and even them out a little bit more, but we still stay in this big rectangle. Now, having done that, I'll hit undo. Having done that, let's go to our next mode, which lives under filter. And under filter, we can go to see the distortion. And now we're seeing how the polygons are getting squished or stretched. Specifically, if it's blue, it's getting squished. If it's red, it's getting stretched. And you can see that what we just turned into a nice big rectangle is actually distorting it pretty horribly. Things are getting really stretched, really squished, because that's not the way it was meant to be. If I were to select those polygons UW, I can just turn off pin border points, hit apply, and it's pretty much going to put it back to what it used to look like. Eve remove, scoot that over. Now, another new feature that we have is, let's go back to view distort. That's going to pop open our UV settings here. And if I click on display, I can say I want to show shading lines. I'm going to say, no, I want to see the distortion. And something that's cool, let's crank this up all the way, is we can actually see the distortion in the viewport now. We can now see the different points that are getting squished and stretched right there, and we can figure out how to smooth them out or just let this do its job. None of these are very badly distorted, so that actually works pretty well for me. Now, this next thing is actually incredibly important, and I'm so happy that it's here now as far as UVs are concerned. Let's go to our other model, let's say the hands, double click on the edges and do the quick process, which is set UV for projection, unwrap the UVs, there's the hands, click on the head, do the same thing, make sure I've got the proper edges, set projection, unwrap the UVs, and there's the head. Now we can do all sorts of things like select this head, grab the polygons, hit R for rotate, spin this 90 degrees, even that out, and that's all going to work really nicely. But I want to make sure that all these are scaled relative to each other very cleanly. So how about clicking on the UV map here? And this should actually show a UV map layout this should actually show a nice image showing the UV layout. If we change the shading back to lines, we can actually see that projected directly onto the model. So if I make this nice and evenly distributed, all I really care about right now is them being evenly distributed. So if I were to make sure I have all those polygons selected, T for scale and scale up or down, you can see how I'm seeing more or less of the grid. So you see right there, a nice big box kind of encapsulating the eye. Going back to the hands, grabbing the UVs and the model. Let's zoom up on one of the hands. I've got the entire thing selected. Hitting T for scale, I could scale up or down. And once again, I want that to be about the size of the overall eyeball. That seems pretty good. Then back to the body and the UV tag of the body, select all of those. And let's make sure that these are pretty even. And that's not bad. Let's make it a little bit smaller, which means making these bigger. And you can see that those are now spaced out in such a way that that box feels about, maybe a little big. That's about the size of what they were on the eye. Now that we've done that, here's the actual new feature inside of Cinema. Selecting all of the models and all of the UV tags, we can now see them all showing up at the exact same time. In the past, you can only see one at a time. Now, most of the tools get grayed out here because there's not much we can change with all of them selected, but the most important one we can do, and that is under UV packing. Currently, I have it set to geometry and preserve orientation. So if I spun something, I want it to stay there. If I click apply, it is now going to pack all of those into this one space. So 3 different objects could have the exact same material applied and they could be sharing it without having to actually be the same model. These all get distributed. They all lay out exactly the way we want to. We can make changes to it if we were inclined by selecting just one of them to make changes to. And let's say these legs are not rotated very well. So I'll hit R for rotate and spin it like that. And maybe we'll use that nice align tool. I'll select that edge and that edge. Say I want to align UV islands. Now those are straightened out. Selecting all 3 models again, selecting all 3 tags, and selecting everything. I could say, hey, I want to redo that UV packing. Just click apply again. Everything will get resorted, placed into a new spot with the orientations being maintained. There's a lot of options to play with here. They're all the ones we've had, but now you can do it with more than one model. So we could say, we could let them spin, we could let them stretch, but right now all of them are individually scaled by us and now placed to maximize the area. Of course, we're free to go and tweak and modify these as we want. But it's just another really great improvement to the UV workflow in Cinema 4D. Tackling a small quality of life feature next, a bunch of our deformers have now been changed to just make them easier to use. To give them context, let's jump into the content browser, and there's a bunch of new objects, and we'll be covering some of the other new ones later, but let's go into houseplants and bring in an orchid. Got a nice real world scale orchid, comes in all tiny. Let's check out what we've got with a bend deformer. You will immediately see we've got a new gizmo that is telling us what the up direction is and the direction in which it's going to bend. Let's make this a child of the orchid, click fit to parent, which sometimes that just doesn't work because of the way a model is built. So here's a nice little workaround. If you put this into a connect object, holding down Alt as I create a connect, we'll make that an automatic parent. Now, if I drop the bend in and say fit to parent, that'll automatically jump to it, and now I'm free to yank both of those out. It's just a workaround I like doing when a model isn't cooperating. So once again, we've got our nice little highlights as we drag the deformer around. I can make that a direct child, and now, very simply, it is trivial to see what direction we're going to bend. The up is the bend direction, and then off to the right is the angle. So as I increase the strength, it's going to bend over in that direction. Something else that's nice is you'll notice that these actually have sliders now. Before, it was just a number we had to type in, but now it's very simple to spin this around to a particular angle and get it lined up how we want and spin it via just dragging this slider. This also applies in that exact same way to the twist, where you can see we can see the angle that that's going to spin. We have the same on the shear for the orientation, and the taper gives us the direction it's going to be pulling in, as well as the upward direction. So nice little quality of life improvement. The viewport continues to improve inside of Cinema 4D. Let's go over a couple of the older ones that we've gotten recently. First of all is the reflections showing up. If we turn on reflections, we can see our reflectance workflow with all these materials. These don't have color channels, they just have reflectance. We can see those now. Turning on our SSAO, we can get kind of a real-time ambient occlusion, which looks great everywhere. And then on top of that, let's get some depth of field turned on so we can get some instant feedback, how the depth might look and how strong it is in the viewport. But now let's go ahead and hit Alt-V as a shortcut to get to the viewport settings. Clicking on this active viewport window, going down to the Effects tab, I can twirl down Reflections. And inside Reflections, there are Screen Space Local Reflections. That checkbox was there before, but this functionality was not. Let's turn that on. And I can see in real time now reflections of our windows in the floor. I can see highlights of our fluorescent bulbs showing up in the floor here. You see how we can see the actual fluorescent lights showing up. We get a reflection-based shadow coming off of this sphere. Everything, it's just so nice to be able to see this in real time. And like just the idea of framing and lighting, getting that all set up, like what a huge difference that makes. Zooming up over here, I guess it's still focused on there, so I'll turn off the depth of field. Look at the reflections that we're getting from the floor onto these objects. It's just so nice to be able to get that type of feedback everywhere. So just another wonderful addition to the viewport. I have a really, really big announcement from Rocket Lasso, and that is we have released our very first plugin. My brother Danny and I have been working on this for a long time, and I am just so excited to finally get this out into the world. Now, if you like the free tutorials I put out there, if you enjoy the live streams where I answer questions from everybody, that is all being supported by these tools. Rocket Lasso, as a company, does not take on client work, so our full-time job is making tools for you. Recall is really powerful, and it has a fast and intuitive double-click workflow. I have been using it extensively, and I'm looking forward to using it more and more in the future. It's been killing me not to be able to talk about it until we had it completely done. Check out the link below for lots of information about Recall. There are so many use cases for it. It can speed you up in so many different ways. I think it's something really unique for Cinema 4D. Very important to note, if you are supporting on Patreon, there are a bunch of coupons. So if you are supporting at the $10 level, you'll get an $11 coupon. If you're supporting at the $50 level, you get a $51 coupon. So in addition to getting Recall, you can also get access to all of the archives of bonus streams and the scene files included from all of the proper live streams and the bonus live streams. If you would like to support Rocket Lasso and the work that I do, the best way to do it is actually to pick up a plugin that's going to help with your workflow. Check the link in the description to see how Recall can help you and how you can support Rocket Lasso and the things that I do. Now back to R23. Here's a small thing, but I had mentioned in the content browser that there are some new objects, and I just thought these are very nice to be able to work with. I recently did a tutorial about doing growth effects with a bunch of different cool things, and here you can see a version of this. It's actually erasing out things. It's all via a vertex map, and it's a really fun additive process for like mowing the grass and things like that. So you should definitely check out that tutorial. However, here, all these grass elements were found in the content browser, but they've added more since then. So how about we delete all of the current grass that's inside this cloner and go into the content browser. Under 3D Objects Volume 2, we have plants, and inside there we have grass elements, low resolution, and in here they've added a whole bunch of different types of grass. I'm going to grab everything after the dandelions, scroll all the way to the bottom, and select all of these, drag them into the viewport, and under Objects, let's go back, select everything we just dragged in, drop them all as children of the cloner, and instantly we're going to get a full kind of field of wheat. A lot of plants, a lot of weeds and grass. These will be blowing in the wind, just working along with the tutorial, so it's a great addition to that tutorial, but I just think these are really great elements for everything from architectural renders to daily renders to just something nice in the background on pretty much everything you do. So I really like that they added those in. Here's a fun addition in R23. Under the character menu, under character, there are 2 new templates for automatically rigging up your stuff. Specifically, there is a face rig and there is the new tune rig. I'm not going to rig anything up at this moment, but in the content browser, let's delete that. In the content browser, under the example scenes, we have character rigging, and inside there we can find several new meshes, including Sporty and Artista, which is part of their new short film, which if you haven't seen, you should totally check out. It's really nice. Double clicking on Sporty, we're going to get a fully fledged rig set up, ready to go, and it's got amazing cartoon proportions. So if I were to click on these controls, I can manipulate the character around, and what's really nice is that it's built to have like stretchy arms, and we hit T for scale and scale pretty much every parameter up and get some very, very cartoony looks going on pretty much everything. In addition to being able to work with a nice built-in facial rig that I'm actually pretty impressed with overall. It's pretty cool. So we'll be seeing this character in a little bit, but let's spend a moment and use this tune rig and rig up that same female mesh that we were using earlier. Going back to this model from exactly where we left off, how about we turn on that connect object, make it editable so everything bakes down to one model. And we will need the character object. Now, if you haven't used this, it can take a little bit of effort to do it, but that's the entire point of this section, is not only showing a little bit of the tune rig, but showing a tool that can help fix all of your rigged characters. In this case, I will play with the tune rig, clicking on root. That will create a root, and then I can make a spine. That makes the overall spine. We could fix the step by step, which is something I typically do actually, which is clicking on adjust and now going to perhaps a front view. Very simple to select this. This is actually where the hips go, so I can start that right on the hips. Turn off snapping. That shouldn't be snapping around. That's at the bottom placement. Here's where the chest should pivot. So scooting that down a little bit. Here's where the neck begins, and here is where the head should start. Excellent. And then once that's done, I go back to build and I can add the arms. If I hold down Control, it'll actually create both arms at the same time, and symmetry is automatically turned on as well. Going to adjust, I can move these arms to where I want them to be. So let's move this shoulder section up. The arm pivots from right here. And I'll probably fast forward through making most of this because these aren't specifically new features inside of this version of Cinema. Now that was pretty quick and dirty. Let's see what we can get from here. Actually, let me scoot that one down there. Okay, so now I've done that. Clicking on the binding tab, I should be able to drag the body in, and that's automatically going to put a weight tag on it and a skin deformer, and it should just be bound and working now. So clicking the animate button, we should have a fully ready to go rig with the best that the auto weighting can do. Now, there's definitely going to be some areas that aren't working amazing, and we might tweak those. However, let's get our controls set up. First of all, if we're going to be controlling these, selecting these controls can be a little bit of a pain. So I'm going to go to select, selection filter, and say none, and then select selection filter spline. So the only thing I can select anymore is a spline. So now I can just very carefully or very easily select something like that and start moving this around. Now you're going to see right out of the gate that it's not amazing. Like there's a lot of motion happening, which is cool. Let's turn on our subdivision surface. You can see how this is deforming, and it's definitely a bit clunky. You can see the way this arm is deforming is not looking super great. And if I were to select, say, the foot here and pull it up, let's see what we get here. Like, oh, look, it gets really chunky right there. The foot bend, the way this is connecting to the body is getting really badly pinched. I mean, if you need something really quick, it works in a pinched. But in this case, I think we can do better, and we can do better via a new tool that has been introduced in R23. And that is the strangest named thing called Delta Mush. And Delta Mush is essentially the closest you're ever going to get to a one-click solution to solving these types of problems. The Delta Mush is a deformer that goes after something like the skin deformer. So just by dropping that in, instantly, look at how much that just improved. Let's turn this off and on by its defaults. Turn this off and on. Look at this arm twisting looking really weird, the elbow looking weird, especially right here in the armpit shoulder area. Turn that on and look at how much better that is right out of the gate. Look how the leg connects to the body. Turn this on and off. Like, look at what an improvement that is. Look at this pinch happening. Turn it on, off, on, off. Look at the leg. Look how much that's intersecting and pinching really weird. Turn it on and look at how much smoother that is. This is all with its defaults. As I said, you can tweak additional things. There's a lot of settings, but honestly, that's the impressive version of it, is how much good that can do with something that was automatically weighted and how it will clean all of that up. Now, like I said, this is a fun cartoony rig. You see how pretty quickly I was able to set up those basic points. I have not re-weighted anything. We probably would have to. I think the head's probably going to not look great with the way it's going to be weighted. Yeah, by weighted default. So we need to fix some weighting like that. But as far as the things that got decently weighted, you can see how much the Delta Mush is cleaning that up. Now, there's actually a lot more features and controls inside of there. We can change the number of iterations, so I could increase this. Although I don't think increasing the iterations necessarily makes things better. Let's pull the arm up so we can see the worst case scenario. We could increase the number of iterations. You see it's going to kind of fix that a little bit, but at a certain point, it's going to make everything really smushy. So on the arm, it doesn't look too bad, but if we look at the leg, you're going to see that it's going to get pretty, like, we're losing so much definition so quickly. So a little bit like, oh, that looks so good. Like maybe 10-ish iterations look amazing. Going beyond that can get weird. We also have smoothing view, so you could just start smoothing everything, but of course that's going to make it look odd. There's a bunch of different modes for the tangents and the way it's picking out what is getting smoothed and what isn't. There's different smoothing types as far as being fixed or proportional. In essence, it's calculating what the original position of this mesh is and figuring out what has changed from one point to the other and how should it transition between them. There's an initialize, so you can set the initial state and it might speed things up. But a very important detail is there's also tags that we can add to this. Now, this rig is not set up to do it, but just to show you, there are Delta Mush tags, and these could be applied to individual joints and sections of the body, and you could give different areas, different properties with their own fall-offs and their own vertex maps. So different things could have different weighting, like the knee might be different than what the shoulder looks like. But the important part here is how much good that did right out of the gate with the defaults. And I'm just kind of blown away by how nice that ends up looking. So that is a quick introduction to the Delta Mush. Here we are back in the warehouse scene, although I am actually on a completely different computer right now. The settings we're going to talk about, actually something about my video card does not like them, so still figuring out what might be up with that, but I'm actually on an older PC laptop, so give it a little bit more leeway for the amount of refreshing. It's pretty old at this point. So what we're going to be talking about is actually the implementation of Magic Bullet looks inside of Cinema 4D directly. Now you get to it by clicking into your render settings, Command or Control B in this case. And under here, we have Magic Bullet looks. I actually already pre-built these a little bit, but if I were to turn this on, then right now in this preview and in my viewport, we're automatically going to see a change in the way that it looks. And just for fun, let's click on these other render settings where I have different Magic Bullet looks. And that's going to completely recolorize. You can see that I'm getting some lens distortion. There's some flare. Lots of stuff's going on. We can click on Open Magic Bullet Looks, and it's going to pop open the Magic Bullet Looks interface. And we've got lots of different settings, lots of tools to be doing kind of live compositing straight out of Cinema. And we can do different lens effects, camera effects, post ones, subject. There's a lot of really fun little details in here. And then selecting, I actually wasn't familiar with this until I started tinkering here, but some of the changes we can make are pretty neat. And the fact that we can see this all right in the viewport, changing different LUTs we could feed in here, completely different looks we can pull in and out. We got a renoiser to get some sharpening and then some grain fed in. There's a lot of really cool opportunities here. So I look forward to playing with this more. If I hit check on the checkbox, it's going to apply that as the current effect. And now it's going to show up here in the viewport so we can actually see it live and know what we're going to get. And keep in mind, this is just the viewport. There is no render going on right now. So this is the screen space reflections on the floor. And all of this is happening live. Like I said, it's on a laptop, so it's going to struggle a little bit as I move around. But we are just getting all of this happening right here in the viewport. And the idea of being able to do that type of feedback, I don't know. It's pretty cool. Doing pre-visualization directly out of the viewport seems like something that is a lot more viable now. Let's bring back Sporty, the Toon Rig from the content browser. Yes, open another one for me. Now, sadly, because I've been so busy trying to launch Recall, I didn't have as much time as I would have liked to be able to go and really play super deep on all these and make my own rigs necessarily. So we'll just work from this really great rig inside the content browser to talk about the new Pose library. The Pose browser can be found underneath Character, Manager, Pose Library Browser. Now, this very unassuming window is actually very powerful, but it's also very specific. This is one of two new tools that I think are very much designed for like character TDs. It's going to be, I mean, people can definitely use them, but it gets really specific and it's really meticulous. So I expect to make some tutorials on this stuff in the future in more detail, but let's make one from scratch right now. One of the first things that's super duper important to know is that your poses that you make are not saved with your scene file. They're actually saved into your preference folder because in theory, any poses that you make with your character could be transferred over to other characters, but it's based on the way things are named. And like I said, this gets really specific. So let's start to tinker a bit. Now, what is the pose library good for? Well, it's for repetitive poses that you're going to be jumping back to pretty often. So maybe some different like hand gestures, like pointing and the fingers being straight out or doing a peace sign or just like a fist or them splayed out. But another good place to use it is in facial expressions, more specifically phonemes. Phonemes are kind of like the key mouth shapes that are used by a lot of animators to get key poses. And this is a way of building out a library that you can very quickly jump to them. And it's pretty powerful, but once again, it's very specific. Now let's take a look at some phonemes. Here is just a quick Google search for phonemes animation. And we can see a bunch of different images of people doing different examples of it. Now, I would say that the best way you could possibly do it is get a mirror and look at the different mouth poses that you're doing. Good idea to always exaggerate them a little bit. And, but having something like this reference would be good. I think I might make a couple of the poses from here, and I'll just keep that off to the other window as I build them. As I said, I feel like the pose library is a tool that's maybe built for people specifically doing rigging, specifically like some sort of animation TD, because there's a lot of very specific steps. As I mentioned, it begins with the preferences, the preference folder. So selecting that, I can create a new library. Clicking on that, there's our new library. I could name this Sporty because that's this character. And then we still can't do anything because we need to create a group. Clicking on group, we get a new group. This could be called the phonemes group. And that is now made. Now, anything that has a little star next to it means it is not saved yet. If I were to close this, if I close Cinema, if I close this window, it is going to lose anything that we saved. So you have to make sure you hit the save button here. And now they are actually saved. And you have to keep on, every time you make a change, hit save if you don't want to lose them in the future. The next very specific thing that we need to do is we need to put the character into some sort of pose. So let's zoom up quite a bit on the mouth. And we need to decide of everything that is going to be controlled here. Let's store the first pose as sort of the default that we have here. Let's say we don't want to lose this particular pose. What we need to do is select every single control that we want to be involved in it. So I will select all of those and make sure that we don't have anything that we don't want. So maybe I accidentally selected something back here. I didn't, but now you see I have an entire big group of controls and all of those are going to be stored. So the way I store them is they are currently selected. Zoom up on the mouth to frame it up nicely, select phonemes, and then click on the last icon right here, and that will add a new pose. Now, by default, it's got nothing. It's just a new pose, and you see all these objects are listed in it. Let's just call this default. And then let's click this little render icon, and that will create a screenshot of what we're currently looking at to store that pose. Now let's create another one, some new pose. Now a good default here would probably be closing the mouth. So how about we do that? I'll grab the jaw, pull this up until the teeth are pretty much right on top of each other. Select the bottom row of lips very carefully. Start to pull those up. The middle one needs a little bit more. And we'll make 1 or 2 poses here, and then I'll probably fast forward and make additional ones. So I'll pull this down. And even here, you see that these are needing a little bit more attention. We can rotate them, and those actually, rotating is a variable on these. So we can spin those a little bit, help close those, and just pull this up enough to get it pretty dang closed. I'm not going to worry about being super perfect here, but we'll rotate that up a bit, pull it up a bit, and move that down to help close it a little bit. I mean, if we wanted to, we could have a sliver of it being open, but I think that what we've got right there is fine. Pretty close. In fact, yeah, I'll make sure that there is a sliver of it being open. Good enough. Zoom back up on the mouth. Actually, don't zoom up. First, select every single control that we want to be involved. So selecting all those and the jaw. Once again, making sure I didn't accidentally grab some other control. Something that would probably be a good idea would be, let me see if this works actually, creating a selection filter. So select selection filter. I want to create a selection object, and this can just be called mouth all, and those will be all the controls for the mouth. So if I double click on that, it'll automatically select all of those controls. So now that all of them are selected, I can zoom up on whatever angle that I like, click plus on the pose. Here is a new pose, and then rename it to closed, and click the render icon to render out that. Now you'll see that these all have the little star next to it. They are not saved, so clicking save is going to save those. Let's make one more mouth state here before I fast forward. Let's just make a nice mouth shape. Now, actually, if we click on default, I want to jump back to that one. So I can drag the slider up, and now you'll see I'll jump back to that particular pose and then hit enter. Very important. I'm going to hit enter, and it kind of bakes that in right now. So let's make the mouth pose. So I'll select this jaw control, pull that down. And then I think we want the bottom lip to be pretty flat here. So I'll pull this up and grab these two, pull those bits of the lip up. And even now I'm looking at my mouth as I do this. So I'll shrink this in a hair as the mouth stretches up. If we're going to maintain the volume, which is probably a good idea to pull those in. Let's see, I should be able to grab this top part and pull it up, and that's actually going to move the entire top part of the mouth up. So the top teeth move up and all the lips. So that actually is quite nice. Do that. So there we go. That's a fine looking So not making it, I mean, we could change the tongue. We could change the bottom teeth if we were inclined, but I think that works pretty well. Double clicking on mouth all, frame ourselves back up again on the relevant part of the mouth. Click plus to add in the new pose. Click on new pose, say or a. Click the render pose icon, and that works quite well. I'll go through and create some more of these in a fast forward. All right, we've got some different mouth poses going here, hopefully all working pretty nicely. Let's move on to the next step. These are all nice and organized. They all have a thumbnail associated with it. And because of that, I can now click on this button right here, which will pop open our thumbnail view. Expanding this a little bit, we can see all of the different mouth poses that we've built. And it should be, if we did it correctly, as simple as clicking on each one of these images and it will jump to that mouth pose automatically. In addition to that, if I were to click on one of them, that's fine, it jumps to it, but I can also click and start dragging the slider and move a proportion of the way from whatever I'm currently doing all the way to what this looks like. And then if I hit enter, it bakes it down. You have to remember to hit enter because otherwise it will just pop out of existence. But by doing that, I could say, okay, I wanted some enter, and now I'm in this pose, and now I can start adding some and as I drag this, it's going to start transitioning into this position. So I don't have to go all the way. I could just go to part of it and then hit enter, and it'll bake that down as a particular pose. At any given moment, if I do see a new pose that I think is pretty good, I could bake it in automatically. We should zoom in here, keeping in mind this is not going to render. Let's see what's a good pose. Well, let's just do a default mouth, and it will start transitioning it to this O like that. And let's say that this is giving us a nice kind of I type sound. I could just click new pose, and now a new pose has been created. You see it says new pose. I should go back into this menu and rename it, and this is going to be an I type sound, and I already got it automatically created the thumbnail for me, so that's fine. So I'm able to jump back and forth between these. Now, a ton of these have not been saved yet. Very important to click the save button, so those actually become saved. They're saved not in the scene file, but in your preferences. So I should be able to go back here and we can start talking about actually doing some sort of animation. But before we do, there's one last thing I'd like to mention, and that is by its fundamental nature, what these poses are doing. We have stored the information about individual objects as we went, but we don't have to store every object on every time. So we're doing these phonemes, but in theory, we could do a second menu, a different facial expression, but I'll keep it in the phonemes here. Let's just go back to our default, and I'm going to modify this again. Let's grab just the mouth tips here, and let's make a smile this time. So just with those two objects selected, I will drag them way up and make a smile shape. And you know what? It's a cartoony character, so let's make it broader. We'll pull those out like that. And perhaps even all these controls on the edges. Those can move up a... Actually, no, I don't want to move those. I just want to keep the at the outside. So we'll keep it real simple with these. I could technically rotate them if I wanted to, so that could potentially open up the mouth a bit more. Let's just do that. So all I've done was moved these two outer controls. So now I've done that. How about we zoom up on the character again? I'm going to close the browser for a moment. Zooming up on the mouth again, let's store this. Now, I'm not double clicking the mouth all, I just have those two controls stored. So clicking a new pose, I can now rename, well, let's render it and call this one smile. And while we're at it, how about we go back to the default and make a frown, which should hopefully be as simple as pulling these down. So those are moving down, and we'll keep it that simple. So those are down, and we created a frown. Zooming up again, let's render the icon and call this one. Oops, that was the default. Hit undo. Actually, it's interesting. So I accidentally overrode that, and apparently you can't undo that. So I'm going to go back to the default pose, re-render it, and then now pull down the frown. And be very careful not to hit re-render, but instead click new pose. And now I've got new pose. This will be the frown. And now there's a frown. Let's save that. And now the power of this comes in. If we pop open the... Let that save, and now pop open the manager, which I moved somewhere. Let's pop that open. Okay, now we've got our thumbnail view again. And now you'll see, let me show you. We can jump to any mouth pose that we want. Let's say the O shape. And then I can start dragging up the smile, and it's not going to have any effect except on the objects that we specifically recorded for us. Now we can do the O shape and then start pulling up into a smile from there. We could do the E shape. So click the E, let it snap to there, hit enter, and now start pulling up the smile and get a smile on top of that, because those are the only controls that were recorded at that time. So there are some more advanced combinations. I forgot to do a thumbnail for the frown, but you can see as I can pull that down and he's going to begin to frown. I do suggest when you're making these to overshoot the position you want, because you can only go to, you can't go above it. You see it's kind of locked there. So if I want to make him frown, let's even fix that. Why not? Pop back open the pose library, go back to the frown. And let's make sure that the frown is dragged up and applied. And now, from this point of view, I'm going to pull that way down. So he's got a mega frown based on that. Now, I shall override this. I think if we click select, send selected object, that should do an override. And then create a thumbnail of that. Now you see it's way down. That's all overridden. Save it again. So now that I've done that, now we've got the frown. So we can smile and we can frown as we pull those. So yeah, smile. Oh yeah, and always remember and hit enter and now start pulling down the frown. I can go way down, but I can go part way if I want to. So that is all working very nicely. We can get these different mouth poses and very quickly get a basic mouth animation going. And why don't we go about doing something like that? We don't have all day to spend on this, so let's just try and make the character say hello. Now, we haven't talked about it yet, but some more new features are underneath our keyframes, our automatic keyframing. We can now record active objects, record animated, or record hierarchy as we go. In this case, I think we want to record animated, and let's select all of the mouth shapes and then record them right now. So clicking auto record, so it's automatically recording. and clicking that button one time to keyframe them right now. So these should be actively keyframed. Moving to some other frame, let's say frame 4, just as a test, let's click on the O mouth shape, hit enter to bake that down, and instantly you see a keyframe was automatically created for us, but only on objects that were already keyframed. So I should be able to transition between these two shapes, and we can see the mouth actually transition between those two. So that is actually working quite nicely. Let's do the hello shape. So I'm thinking, let's start out with the default smile. Now that should automatically have overridden because as soon as I hit enter, it should automatically override. And now hello. So let's go for an E sound. So we'll move a few frames over. That's an O. I'm going to click on the E, and it's going to jump to the E sound. If we hit enter, that should bake that down, and I should be able to transition between these. So, and let's go to 8. This is way too many frames, but let's go to the L shape. So I've got a L or La. I can drag this up, or I could just click the button and jump full power to it. So let me pull that up pretty far, hit enter to bake that down, and that should now be transitioning there. Hello. And now let's move to an O. So we'll go another 4 frames and click on the, actually, let's just transition into the O. O. And that's fine. I went full power, enter. And let's go another 4 frames and return back to the default mouth. And we'll even pull up, hit enter, and then drag up the smile a little bit, hit enter, just to bake those down. And now let's see what we got. Hello. And then returning to a smile. So that's not too bad. Let's hit play. See what we get. Hello. Drag, select all of these keyframes, drag them all over to make it way smaller. Let's just put one keyframe in between each one. See what that looks like. Hello. Now it's not playing back in real time. It's a complicated rig and I'm recording, so it's not playing back in quite real time. But, oops, undo. But as I drag, you can see how I get these different mouth shapes. Now, here's something that's just very important from the point of view of, I'm a big fan of hand keyframing everything. But if you're in a production environment, obviously being able to build out these shapes and jump between them is super important. But don't let these pre-built shapes like fully determine your character. I can go and quickly jump to the shape, but then be like, okay, that's the way the mouth looks like by default, but he's saying hello, so he should be smiling. So let me make sure that as he goes, that there's a little bit of a smile in there. Bake that in, move forward, and that's the oh, hello. And then so that can also have a smile, hit enter. But keep in mind that, you know, this is a very symmetrical face. So here, maybe this should be up a little bit more. And that should automatically keyframe as I drag it, jump to the next one. And now maybe there should be a hint of a smile on here. And it was already a little bit more crooked on one side. Go back a frame. Let's have the smile be a little more, oops, I'm on point mode. Go to object mode. Make sure that this is up a little bit extra there, just so it's not symmetrical. And as I jump between these different poses, then with any luck, you can start building a little bit more individual personality and making things move up and down. And the idea of being able to get the animation, hello, quickly by building out these libraries is pretty powerful. Now, we did not spend a lot of time talking about some of the different settings in here. We have, this will automatically be limited to the selection, and it's attempting to match it based on the name. It's looking for the name of this object. As I said, these are not actually these objects being saved. It is this entire library being stored, and it's looking for an object called upper lips underscore con plus is what it is looking for. So if you have a different character with that setting, that would work. And there's different settings in here, such as searching the name from matched to the end, or based on a namespace, or based on a separator. And we could also limit this to the selection or the hierarchy or global. So there's a bunch of different combinations here. But if you do it meticulously and you do it in this kind of straightforward way here, you see it didn't take that long to build these out, and the power I can get now to transition between these different shapes, it could be really, really good. So that should wrap up this section. Next up are animation improvements. These are sprinkled all throughout Cinema, and I'm kind of surprised at how many there are. In this case, I've opened up the living room scene from the content browser just so we can see more of that. And the first thing I'll show is if I were to paste in this little animated character here into the viewport, one thing that's going to happen is, even though his animation is longer than the current timeline, it's not going to jump the timeline longer. So it is able to handle just being here in the scene without changing the time. Next up is a tiny thing, but man, is it going to help a little bit all the time, and it's really the little thing to help. And that is if we change our timeline, which is currently at 45, if I change that up to something like 90, the bar will automatically grow to match it. So no more do we have to change that number and then change this bar to match it. It will automatically come into the scene. Next up, let's create a camera. And the first thing to note is we now have the ability to keyframe things before, well, things are outside of the timeline range. So in this case, I could rewind this to -1 and record the position and rotation at the time of -1. Before, we used to have to like rewind the timeline to show that, but very often you record like characters at -1 and things like that. So now it's automatically working. But let's undo that because we don't need it. Hitting play, we have our little robot walking across the table. What I would like to do is have this camera do a very fast fly around here. So let's intentionally make an amazing camera move of recording at the time of 0 and then fast forwarding to the very end and spinning to some other side over here and keyframing again. There we go. Rewind, hit play, and we should have a single camera movement traveling over. Super amazing. Now, having said that, let's jump into our timeline window. Actually, I'm going to go to my F curves. So window, timeline, F curves, and pop that open. We're going to see we have a lot of things going on in the scene just because of how many keyframes are being brought in by this little robot character. So specifically, something we might want to see is, well, let's just say we want to search for all of the positions of X on everything all over the place. Well, we now can click on the search bar, and before we could only search for the names of the objects. So I could have searched for camera, and yes, the camera will show up. But now I can also search for the camera, and I only want to see position. And now by typing in POS, then now only the camera and the position show up instead of everything. We could clear our camera, and now we're seeing the position of everything. I could type in X, and now we're only seeing the position X of things, or anything that has the name X. And, I could search for body, and now only the body of the robot and X are showing up. So very quick to navigate these. Clearing both of them out, it's amazing having this track name in there. Very, very useful. In any case, I just want to edit my current camera, so I can go and focus in on the different animation tracks, the F curves of the camera. But now there's a new shortcut. If we hold down Alt and Shift as we click Move, Rotate, or Translate, so Alt Shift, in this case E, then it's only going to show the position tracks. I can hold down Alt Shift R and it'll show rotation, and Alt Shift T would show the scaling tracks. In this case, I would like to see the movement tracks. So let's hit Alt Shift E for move. And what I would like to do is have this camera movement on the overall camera. I would like it to really ease. I want it to like be going really fast in the beginning and then ease way out. So I'm going to just grab our X position and then grab the X final keyframe, drag this way out to really smooth that out. Now, what you're typically going to, if I were to rewind this all the way to the beginning and hit play, we're going to see what typically happens when you're trying to do this kind of modification. And that is, it looks awful. Everything is offset. They're not in sync with each other at all anymore. That's not surprising in this case, because all we did was modify this X position on the F curve. But let's try another new feature, and that is let's select the curves from X, right click and say, copy the E's of those curves. So now if I pull back all of our different keyframes, and I can show all of them by saying View, Hide, Unhide All, so now I can see the position and rotation. I can select all of these, select all of them, Control or Command A, right click on it and say, I want to paste the E's. Then the E's has been translated onto all of these different tracks, meaning if I were to now rewind and hit play, we should accelerate in and then slowly ease out. We've now been able to modify all the tracks just by modifying one of them and copying it over. And the camera is still looking where we originally wanted it to, and we didn't have to compensate with a target tag or something like that. Next up, rewind all the way. Next up is a nice little organizational tool. If we were to select the camera and then click on this filter, then it's going to show some new settings here, specifically animation tracks, keyframe selection, animatable attributes, espresso driver driven, and overridden parameters. By turning on these different attributes, our attribute manager will show only very specific things. In this case, it's only going to show the tracks that have keyframes, or we could turn off everything that isn't keyframeable. So we can't animate the order of HBB. So I can say, okay, don't show that, and that will be hidden. also show things are only espresso driver driven. And finally, overridden parameters, which I still need to look up what that does exactly. To wrap up this animation workflow improvements section, let's go and make a little animation from my robot here. First of all, I'll jump my timeline up to 1000 frames. You'll see the preview range automatically jump up to that longer length. Now, I don't actually want to see all of that, so if I pick some other arbitrary time, let's say around 29 frames in, if I hold down Shift while I push O, that'll actually set the output for the range now. There's a new shortcut for Shift-I or Shift-O for the input or output range. So now with that in mind, let's rewind to the time of 0 and record the keyframes of everything about this character. So I will just click keyframe, which is what we've had for a while. Now, what I'd like to do is turn on auto keyframing, meaning anything that I record will automatically get recorded when it changes. The problem with that mode traditionally is anything else you do in Cinema, if I forget to turn it off, if I create a cube, if I change some parameter I don't want to change, if I move my camera, all of that could get keyframed. But now we've got a couple different modes we can play with. In this case, I've already recorded everything one time very specifically, so I can say, I just want to record animated. So only something that's already keyframed will be keyframed again. In this case, I'll just move one frame further and select a couple of controls here. So I want this character to be animating a little bit, maybe a little bit of a dance. So actually, at the time of 0, I'll have him look up in the air, and then after that, he can look down a bit. Take the waist area, drag this down, rotate him forward, push him backward a bit. Take the arms, I'll pull that out a little, even flail the hand out. And every time I do, this is keyframing the position and rotation of these objects. So now if I hit F to go back, well, let's record the eyes as well. Move those up. And let's go back a frame. And you can see he'll jump back to this position. I want to pull these eyes down in this case. So now you can see I'll look up and down, and I can keyframe back and forth and see those changes take place, and nothing else will have been accidentally recorded. Now, in addition to that, let's go one more frame forward and keyframe a few things. Let's say I want this to look up and over, and I want this hand to be down further, and the body can be moved. And then I'm like, you know what? No, I didn't want to keyframe all that. I can select all of the objects that might have keyframes, and there's a new button down here called Delete Keys. And by clicking that, every single keyframe on that frame will have been deleted. If I hit F, we'll see it refresh, and now there is nothing on keyframe 2. Anything that was keyframed on these objects is now gone. Very nice to be able to do that and not have to do it manually. So with what I want to have keyframed, already keyframed, let's turn off the auto keyframing to get rid of that big red outline and move into the timeline. So Window, Dope Sheet, or I can hit Shift F3 as the regular shortcut. We can see everything that was keyframed here. And I want to change the timing of my second keyframe. So let's say he's going to be dancing to a song, and maybe I know what the beats per minute of that is. If you have pretty much any song, you can just Google the song and BPM and typically find the beats per minute. Now in this case, what we can do is click the Add Markers button, and that's going to pop open a tool to create markers. But now we can click on multiple markers and set things like a total count or a BPM. So I know that the BPM is 117. So when I hit OK, it's actually going to create a marker every 117 beats per minute separated. So that is very clean to be able to set that up. So now it's pretty simple to go and move this around and know exactly where it's going to be falling inside of that animation. Now, if I want to be really precise, I could just click on this top keyframe and it's 117. I could say divided by 30 because I'm at 30 frames a second. And now it jumps to 3.9 times 2. And now it's exactly half of that beats per minute. So now, just to have fun with it, how about selecting the entire summary? And I want this to repeat by going to After and setting this to Oscillate. So now, going to, let's hit Tab actually. And I can select everything. And here are my keyframes. I just want to make sure that they ease in and ease out. Click that. So now definitely easing in and easing out. Let's hit play and see what we get. We got our character, and now he's bopping up and down based on this timing on 117 beats per second. If I want to get a little bit of animation, perhaps I could take the head and select its keyframes, scoot it forward just one frame there. Select the hands and select those keyframes. Pull those. Let's make sure I actually grab them. Select those and pull those forward 2 frames. And I get a little bit of overlapping animation on the character. Give that a pause. And we could stretch this out to see the entire timeline. And at any point, I could, of course, go into my timeline and modify things based on what's happening on the beat at these different times. But for now, the simple version is I've got this looping animation. Going back into the timeline one more time, it is worth mentioning that we can select all of these different markers, and selecting them inside of it, we can set a length to the markers. In this case, maybe something like 14. And now each of them have that range set. So I can jump between these different ranges by clicking the shortcut Control Shift, and then, F and G. F and G are the normal frame forward, frame backward. But if you hold Control and Shift, we'll actually jump to the beginning of the next range. And you can see it's actually not only jumping to the next range, but it's also showing exactly that range in the timeline. So we could work directly within that limitation by jumping back and forth between the different marker ranges. And it's not something I'm doing here, but if we had these all lined up, and it is now possible to go to File, Export, and go to FBX. Before we could export takes from the takes manager, but now we can actually export from the timeline markers, and each one could be a separate little section. And inside video game engines and whatnot, it's a way of isolating different bits of animation. One more important thing is in the FBX export, there's also bound joints only. So you can actually export animations based not on the baked down points, but based on them actually being linked to individual joints. So both of those are very powerful and nice additions to FBX. A specific but very powerful new tool in Cinema 4D R23 is the motion transfer. Inside of the content browser, we now have access to a bunch of original motion capture that Maxon has put together. These are unique to them. So we could bring in any of these skeletons. I am partial to this waving high, hitting play. We can see we've got this nice simple skeleton, and it is indeed waving hello. Now, if we go up a layer, you can see that we have a model, this male puppet, and it's all set up to automatically work here. I would expect that to work, so we'll ignore that part. Let's get a little bit fancier. Jumping in, I have a Mixamo brought in. So from Adobe Mixamo, I brought this model in. It is fully rigged, and I brought it in as a T-pose. So here's an entire skeleton set up, ready to be animated. I could grab any one of these. Let's grab the spine and hit R for rotate, and you can see the character is going to respond. So with that in mind, how about right-clicking on the hips and saying, I want to define the character. Under rigging tags, character definition. That will create this tag. We can now hit Open Manager, which will pop open this manager right here. All we need to do is click the Extract Skeleton button. You can see right now we've got all these zeros under joints, but clicking Extract Skeleton, you can now see that there are 69 different joints stored. If I twirl down torso, you can see we've got one object for the hips, 3 for the spine, 2 for the neck, 2 for the head, etc. So with that created, how about we go into the content browser and find some animation we like. Once again, I like this waving high animation. So you see it already has a character definition tag on that, so we don't need to worry about that. Clicking on the hips, I want to create a solver. That's another tag. You can also find it by right-clicking under rigging and find the solver. Now that the solver is created, it's asking what motion do we want to transfer to the current character. So the source should be this waving high animation. So I'll drag that tag over. And the instant that I do, you can see the character snaps. Let's add a few extra keyframes for ourselves. You see the timeline automatically adapts to the new length, which is nice. Hitting play. Now this character is waving hello immediately, hiding these joints so we can just see the character. It is waving hello and just working. So anything out of Mixamo is transferring over very nicely. Now, this skeleton here is incredibly similar to the one we're referencing, but these do not have to be as identical as that. Let's open up this crazy warrior character, also from Mixamo, and he's also in a T-pose. By the way, it's very important to set them up in a T-pose, otherwise it doesn't know what it should be taking the original reference from. However, I can right-click on the hips, add another rigging character definition tag, open the manager, click Extract Skeleton. Those all get populated. 66 different joints have matched. Now we need some sort of animation. I think it'd be cute to have him waving, so we'll add that in again. Again, click on the hips character definition tag, create the solver. We want to link to this wave from afar, add a few extra keyframes in, hit play. And now this very dissimilar character is doing that same motion. It's transferred over no matter how long the limbs were or how we've stretched them in different places. If it was bigger or smaller, this should all translate actually really well. Now, I tried to go deeper. I did go deeper and figure out how this is working. So I want to show you the results of that. Over here, I have that same model, the motion capture model from Mixamo. I deleted out all of its skeleton, all of the joints, and I remade them myself. So here is a joint chain that I built, incredibly simple. I just kept on making more joints, dragging them to different places. I didn't even worry about rotation. I just placed them where I thought they should go. Then you'll even see here, let me hide the character. You'll even see that I intentionally messed some things up where this arm is incredibly simple. So we got the shoulder, the upper arm, the lower arm. But over here, I put 3 different joints, actually 4 different joints, just to make up this upper arm section. The one thing that's very important if we're going to define this character is when we right click, rigging tag, character definition, and again, open up this manager, is the naming scheme. If I were to twirl down these individual body parts, we can see that if I click on any of them, you can see that it is defining it somehow. So first, let's click extract skeleton, and you'll see that 31 different joints were found. One of them is hips. Why is it hips? Because it is automatically, by default, the way Maxon made it, it's looking for the word hips. So I made sure to name the first object, that one right there, the hips object. And then we have the spine. No matter how many things are named spine, it's going to find them and place them in order. And then one for the neck, one for the head. Now it gets a little bit fancier when you go to the left arm because we have something called clavicle, which essentially is your shoulder. And if you click on it, you'll see that what it's searching for is left and shoulder. It's actually 2 and signs, 2 ampersand. And that's kind of a coding term. It just means and. And this is saying it is looking for the word left and the word shoulder. And if it finds both of those, it will automatically find it and drag it into this joint automatically. Now, if we go further, we have bicep, and it gets even fancier here. It's looking for left and arm, but it doesn't want the word forearm. And the reason it doesn't want that is the next one is forearm, so it doesn't want to confuse it. So here it's looking for anything that has the word left and arm. And I had 3 different joints named left arm, and that's why all 3 got put in. Having said that, we can actually even go further. For instance, this clavicle, I could say this is looking for left arm and shoulder, but I could say left arm and shoulder, comma, or let's say it wants the clavicle. So if we named a character with a clavicle, then now it would find anything with clavicle. But we don't want it to have anything with clavicle. I specifically want anything named left, and then ampersand, ampersand, clavicle. So now it's trying to find a combination of the 2. So left and shoulder or left and clavicle, and it would find those objects and populate them into this particular spot. So you could very meticulously name everything, place them, or make different character rigs that can store these. Here's the default Maxon one. We could save it as a preset. We could make our own. We could add extra body parts into it, make completely new ones. There's a lot of different variations we could do here. In addition to that, this extract skeleton is really just a shortcut. We don't have to do that. You could do it manually. I'll delete this tag, right click, and create a brand new one. So I want the rigging, character definition, and here's the manager, but I could go into torso and say, here are the hips, and then drag the hips in. This could be anything. It could be a null. It could be a cube. I could drag it in, and that is now manually assigned. So extract skeleton is just to speed things up. So you could have a completely crazy skeleton naming wise, but then you have to manually drag it in. Having done all this work though, let's click extract skeleton. It gets built. It is now controlling. Well, I mean, it's set up to control this. And once again, you see it's in the T pose, which is important. So now that I've got that, how about selecting all of these joints, unhide our character, select the character, and I'm going to bind it because right now it's not linked in any way. So character, bind, and I never made any controls here. This is just the skeleton. It is now, in theory, yep, you can see it automatically made the weight tag and the skin tag. So if I had to grab the upper leg and rotate it, you can see that that is now bending. It has bound that mesh to these joints, and that is set up. And very little work, and with no rigging because there's no controls here, I could, let's minimize this. I could go back into the content browser, grab the lovely waving high animation, and with my own skeletal structure drawn there, let's say that I want this to have a create solver. It is going to link my character definition to this waving high from afar, and instantly the character still jumps to it, and if I hit play, it is still going to match that animation. So with very little work, I was able to transfer this to different skeletons and one I made myself, as long as I defined it in the same way that Cinema is looking for it. After just recording that, I thought it might be fun to try and transfer this to something completely unrelated. So here is a little robot character I've been playing with, and I just ripped out all of his controls, renamed some of the joints that are inside him, and let's go ahead and create that same waving animation. You can see the robot is very small, so just for a little bit of movement continuity, I'll hit T for scale. Just scale up the entire character, and there's a lot to it, so it's chugging as it refreshes everything. There we go, nice big giant version of the character. Right-clicking on his skeleton, I will add a rigging character definition, open up the manager, click on extract skeleton, and he doesn't have like a spine or a neck or anything, so there's only 18 joints that could actually match here. However, if I click on create solver, the solver gets made. I want to link it to the waving animation, and if I go ahead and just hit play, it is working shockingly well. Like, obviously, the character's not designed to do this, but that is pretty amazing. And as I said, I ripped out all the controls, so there are just some joints inside, and I renamed them. And I'm transferring the animation onto this character. So, yeah, I think it's actually a pretty robust tool as long as you get the basics right. So, just wanted to toss this in. The last major thing we're going to talk about is something very different for R23. In fact, it's very different for all of Cinema 4D and every single version I've ever played with, and that is scene nodes. One of the reasons it's so different is it's being presented by Maxon as sort of a tech preview. This is not production ready, but they want to get feedback from users about the way it works. It's a big integration of some of the new core, and I think a lot of things in the future might be built upon it. So it's a fun thing to play around with, and a simple way of thinking about it is super espresso, but really it is so much more. Let's open it up by changing our layout from startup layout to nodes. It pops up on the other screen for me. And if your screen is blank here like mine, click on this nodes icon here, and it's going to pop open. Now, when they did their tech preview at SIGGRAPH, they called it Neutron, but now the official name of it is scene nodes. So here are scene nodes. Now, there are a lot of things implemented already, and this is only the very, very beginning of where this is going. So this is going to be a relatively simple and quick demonstration of just some things I've been playing around with. Sadly, I was working so much on Recall and getting that launched that I have not gotten to play very deeply with this whatsoever. So really, these are just things I've been playing around with for the last day. To begin with, let's move this face into this interface. And I can do that by searching for the word legacy and finding a legacy object importer, because in the future, this object manager and everything about it is going to be legacy. So this is the start of that. Selecting this node, it's got some properties. I want to drag in the subdivision surface and then click update parameter ports. And we're going to see a whole bunch of outputs from this node. I can even turn on the subdivision surface and see it all smoothed out. Now, a way this is very different than Espresso is we can do something like search for the word extrude and pull in a geometry extrude. Definitely couldn't do that. And what do we want to do here? I want to take the geometry and output it into this extrude, and then I want to output this geometry into the scene. But before we do that, we need something called a geometry operation. And by dragging this in, it kind of makes it real. So this geometry becomes real, and that can be output into the scene. And immediately you can see every single polygon of this head model is being extruded. Clicking on the extrude node, it has all of its own properties, dropping the offset down to 1, or let's even do 0.5. You can see this is going to drop down. Every single one is being extruded. And, that's pretty straightforward, but nice and clean and parametric. But let's make this fancier, of course. To begin with, how about searching for a random? So we can make a random selection. Here's a random selection. It wants geometry, so I'll drag geometry up to it and then output this selection. So it is the input selection on the extrude, so only those things are being extruded. And I can see random extrudes. With the random selection, we could increase the amount or decrease it. We could change the input seed, and that will change all that. We could keyframe it if we wanted to. However, let's get a little bit fancier. Clicking on the extrude, it's got some nice properties, including use islands. I'll turn that on, and now you can see that Each polygon individually is not being extruded. Now groups are being extruded, which visually I always like a little bit more. Instead of using a random selection, how about searching for the word noise? And there is a noise selection. Pulling this in, instead of using that one, I'll use this. Output that as the selection. And I don't need this random one anymore because we have this noise selection. The noise is quite large by default and the head is pretty small. So I'll grab the scale and start pulling this way back. And as I do, we can see the noise begin to emerge. I think 3% is a good number to see sort of a random pattern. We've got all the different noise types, but we'll leave it on the basic noise of per lin. And that is now what is being extruded, and that is working quite nicely. Let's layer it up even more. I want a second, actually, let's get it animating. So in the noise, you can see that there is a time input. So we need this to be driven by something. Searching for, actually, we can do something else. Let's click the letter C and search for time, and there's time. So we can click C to quickly pull up a commander. So with this time node, I could output the current frame as the input to time. And now hitting play, we should see that animated, but it's way too quick. So we need to slow that down. Let's search for the word multiply, and there's an arithmetic multiply. I can drag that directly onto one of these connecting wires, and that will actually jump in between the two, which is a very nice kind of speed up feature. Definitely don't have that in Espresso. I want to multiply this by some smaller number. It's defaulting to an integer, so that should actually be a float, so we can type in decimals, so 0.01 to make a very small number. Hitting play, now you can see it slowly animating as it goes. Now, as you can see, this is like Espresso, and how many people have used Espresso in any significant way beyond set driver, set driven? So along those lines, think about the iterator node inside of Espresso. Have you used that? Well, when it comes to these scene nodes, that type of level, that depth is kind of built right into the core here. We are getting things like point arrays. Like, are you familiar with what an array is in this context? It's more of like a programming term. In this case, it is every single point in a giant list. And in Espresso, you could do things like iterate, but it would, if you connected two nodes that didn't want to be connected, then it would just turn yellow and not work. But here, I could accidentally multiply an entire array of points with a different array of maybe normals, and I might be doing 10,000 multiplications up against 10,000 normals, and that could really, really be a gigantic calculation that Cinema needs to do. So you have to be careful with the way you're playing with this, in addition to how complicated some of these nodes might look. But I think a lot of the power here, and once again, as a tech demo, is looking really promising. Let's push this a little bit further. How about we double up on this by, let's duplicate most of this. I'm going to copy our noise selection and the extrude. So I've got two of those now. I want to take the end result of this geometry and feed it into the second extrude. And I want this to be fed in, again, to the noise selection. And now it's going to be making a new selection. I want it to be different, so let's put a different random seed, type in some random number, and output that second extrude into the output of the geometry for a geometry operation. And now you can see a second extrude on top of the first one, randomly getting applied everywhere. So with that in mind, let's make it also animate based on time. So I can multiply, well, I feed the multiply into that on the time. So now we have two different nodes being driven by time, which is being multiplied by 0.01, and we can see how it's connected to two different things. And now we have two different extrudes where we get this final geometry popping out in the viewport. Hitting play, we can see that animated, and it's running nicely there. Let's give this a quick save and make this even crazier still. Oh, here's something that's neat. If I select everything, and you go to View, you can see you can arrange the nodes, or select it and just hit the letter L, and it will try and arrange them in a nice way where the wires aren't overlapping too much if we can avoid it. But anyway, I want to make this fancier by putting it into a grid. Let's get some MoGraph type functionality in here. Searching for grid, this definitely trips me up a lot. And if I hadn't practiced this, believe me, I would not look this smooth in it. I've got all these different types of grid. We got a grid offset, a grid distribution, and maybe you'd think, okay, I want to clone things, a grid distribution. It's like, no, that's not a grid distribution. Oh, I want to generate a grid. That's what you want. Nope, that's not what you want. What you want is a distribution operation in grid mode. That's what we actually want. So I'll drag this in. And with this dragged in, let's go ahead and take our final geometry and spit that out into this grid, and then output that grid information into the scene. And hopefully as soon as I do that, we should start getting some copies. Now the face is pretty big, so let's separate these out. In fact, let's simplify a little bit and say 3 by 3 by 3. And I'll change the spacing a bit to, let's do 33 by 33 by 33. And it chokes on those a little bit. I'm not sure why, like, changing those numbers is, but, you know, I'll learn as we go. So now you can see I'm making a grid of some different faces. I could hit play, and these will all be playing very nicely. Hit NA as a shortcut, and I can actually just see the meshes there. Well, let's go ahead and add some color variation to this. Searching for the word color, we can pull in a color operation. What is happening here is, and I think the way it's referred to, it is a data stream. This is a stream of information, and most of the time we're used to in cinema, we kind of have everything all the time, but this is more of the raw components. So we have the basic geometry and we're modifying it, but that geometry doesn't have a color. In fact, it doesn't even exist as geometry until we say, hey, it's geometry. Hey, it is a grid of geometry. And now I'm going to say, hey, this is actually, it has color. So I'll output the color and then output that into the scene. And then hopefully, give it a moment. There we go. You can see colors are in there. I can change the colors to whatever I want. Let's make it a bright green color. And these now have the attribute of color. Prior to that, it didn't have that at all. Now, there are so many nodes. I've barely tinkered with a handful of them. But another one I know that's pretty cool is I can search for the word hash, which is a kind of another technical term. But it's a way of like extracting information from one thing and translating it into another. So in this case, I'm going to twirl down this output and get kind of all of the information that's inside of it. And specifically, I want to steal the index from this. So whichever number clone it is, I'm going to feed that into the random seed of this hash. And now this could be outputting random numbers for us, essentially random numbers because we're changing the random seed. Specifically, I want the color. So I'll output the color from the hash into the color operation. And from that, hopefully, we'll see that we end up getting random colors of all these heads. Now, here's just the thing I don't quite understand from tinkering around. You can see that when I connect some of these nodes, it takes a little while for it to figure it out. But then here's what throws me off and is really cool is let's go ahead and change the count of this thing to 33 by 33. And you can see as I'm typing, it's taking a moment for that to calculate. And let's do another 33. So, okay, this is now creating about 35,000 copies of it, and they all popped in the scene. But now that it kind of chugged when I typed the numbers in, you can now see that they are in the viewport and they are running crazy fast. And this is now, like I said, 35,000 different heads, each having done all that extrusion information, 2 layers of it randomly. But here's the crazy thing is, I'll rewind and hit play. You see this actually playing pretty dang reasonably in the viewport with all of these copies. I can still navigate my camera around and all of these are animating. So the amount of power that we can get from the system is insane. I'm barely scratching the surface of the possibilities here. I mean, I really haven't, but just showing you some of what it's capable of is pretty crazy. Now, as I said, this is being presented as a tech preview. There's no way of interacting with this as an object. We can get this as an end result and it will render. However, it can't be represented in the object manager right now. We couldn't apply a specific material to it from the object manager. It's kind of the final thing that happens. It's the final thing that calculates. The scene nodes are not represented at all in the object manager. So it's definitely a different way of thinking. There are so many nodes. I will definitely be playing with this further. In fact, if you're watching this the day the video got posted, I'll be doing a special bonus live stream for Patreon only, where I'm just going to be playing around with nodes and trying to figure them out. And also tomorrow, I'll be doing a big live stream with Rick Barrett from Maxon, and we'll just be going through the new features, and that's open to everyone. And I'm very much looking forward to that. There is so much to learn and play around with in this version of cinema. And man, these scene nodes it's going to take a little bit to wrap my head around it, but I'm looking forward to the power. And this is a preview of what is to come is pretty exciting. As I mentioned earlier, I have a brand new plugin out into the world. So if you like these free tutorials, if you like my live streams, if you just like the content I put out there for Cinema 4D, the very best way to support me and Rocket Lasso as a company is to pick up a plugin that is going to be super useful to you. So go and check out the videos for Recall. I think it's an amazing tool. I am very much looking forward to seeing the ways that people use it. It is the best way to ensure that I'll be able to continue making free tutorials and doing live streams for everyone. I really enjoy making those, but of course, this is Rocket Lasso's primary job. I'm able to make free tutorials and free live streams because we make plugins. We do not take on client work. We make plugins for artists. We try and make really good tools that are super robust and tested. And between me and my two brothers, we have 20 years of experience making plugins for Cinema 4D. So please go and check that out. It's really appreciated. This was really fun. I look forward to seeing everybody in the live stream for this, as well as future tutorials where we will be playing with things like R23 and just things in cinema in general. So thank you so much for checking this out. See you Wednesday. See you in the next future videos. And that will wrap it up for now. Thank you very much. And this is Chris Schmidt signing out.